Okay, let's unpack this. When you hear Spanish Inquisition, what comes to mind? Is it just, dark robes, secret trials, the burning of heretics? It's this really powerful, almost singular image, right? Focused purely on religious belief.
Yeah, that's the standard picture. But your source material paints something far more complex.
It really does.
We have a significant amount of historical detail here that lets us see the Spanish Inquisition not just as a religious court, but as, well, an institution deeply woven into the fabric of Spanish society, politics, even everyday life for centuries.
Exactly. So our mission in this deep dive really is to get beyond that popular image. We want to understand the true nature of the Spanish Inquisition based on these sources. Because it wasn't static, was it? It evolved, it adapted, and it became a tool used in ways you might not expect.
Absolutely. We'll explore its surprising targets.
Yeah.
Areas far removed from what you'd call obvious heresy. We'll see how it became a crucial instrument of the state. We'll also look inside its operations and examine its lasting footprint on Spain's intellectual, economic, and social landscape.
Okay.
Get ready to see this institution in perhaps a totally different light.
Sounds fascinating. Let's dive in, starting with some of those genuinely unexpected interests the Inquisition pursued.
Okay. What's truly fascinating, I think, is how the Inquisition found itself scrutinizing areas that, well, today seem like deeply personal spiritual experiences, specifically various forms of Spanish mysticism.
Right, like Illuminism or Quietism. You'd think mystic saints would be, celebrated. But the Inquisition got very suspicious. Why was that?
Well, according to the sources, there were several reasons. One big one was claims of impeccability.
Impeccability.
Yeah, the idea that a soul could reach such a state of union with God that acts performed by the body were no longer sinful, even if they looked immoral.
Ah, okay. That sounds like it would worry an institution concerned with sin and moral behavior.
Definitely. It potentially bypassed the need for confession, maybe even priestly absolution, you see.
Right, undermining the structures.
Exactly. And another concern was claims of direct visions, direct conversations with the Holy Ghost. Now, while this was accepted for figures the church deemed orthodox,
Sure.
for others, it raised questions about the source of these visions. Was it divine, or was it perhaps demonic delusion?
Okay.
And it implied a kind of independence from the church hierarchy, setting aside the priest as the sole intermediary.
And I loved this detail from the sources, a certain contempt for theology that sometimes popped up, prioritizing inner feeling over learned doctrine.
Oh, absolutely. That must have rubbed the educated theologians staffing the Inquisition the wrong way. It challenged their authority, their whole intellectual framework.
So how did they deal with this? Was it always harsh?
Well, it varied, especially early on. Figures like Pedro Ruiz de Alcaraz, he was a lay preacher, a mystic, or Francisca Hernandez, they faced pretty serious accusations, things like sexual aberrations or indecent familiarities linked to their practices.
Wow. That sounds severe.
It does, but the sentences, initially at least, could be surprisingly lenient for some.
Really? Like what?
Well, they might get abjuration de levi, that's like a formal but mild renunciation of a minor error or just suspicion of heresy, plus maybe some spiritual exercise.
Okay.
Medrano, another figure claiming impeccability and direct conversation with the Holy Ghost, he also initially got a lenient sentence.
So maybe they were cautious, or just figuring out how to categorize these cases early on.
That seems to be what the sources imply, yeah.
Oh.
Take Maria Cazalla. She was arrested partly because her focus on scripture reading made them confuse Illuminism with Protestantism, which they were definitely targeting.
Oh, okay.
But she was ultimately discharged. It shows the difficulty they had, the confusion sometimes.
But then later on, the pendulum swung towards severity.
It did, yeah. By the later 16th century, these mystical movements were viewed with a lot more suspicion. Even the works of Santa Teresa herself were put on the index of prohibited books for a time, though they were later allowed with some expurgations.
Santa Teresa. Wow.
And her famous disciple, San Juan de la Cruz, St. John of the Cross, he was apparently vindictively persecuted by his own Carmelite order, accused of being an alumbrado, which was the Spanish term for illuminist.
That's incredible, persecuting a future saint for mysticism. Were there exceptions, though, people who escaped this?
Yes, and these exceptions are telling. Francisco de Osuna, who was actually Santa Teresa's preceptor, a high mystic himself, he escaped persecution. His big, influential book just needed one minor expurgation.
Interesting.
And the Venerable Luis de Granada, another major spiritual writer, he also avoided condemnation despite some scrutiny.
So it wasn't uniform, maybe depended on connections, or subtle differences in how they presented their ideas.
That's probably it. The Inquisition's approach wasn't monolithic.
Okay, let's shift to quietism then. Centered on this figure, Miguel de Molinos, his teaching of the quiet of the soul apparently caused a massive stir.
Oh, huge. Molinos taught a path of passive contemplation, aiming for the soul's total union with God. The controversy really blew up around certain notions like having contempt for intruding or sensual thoughts. Even if these thoughts cause suffering, that suffering could then be offered to God. Critics worried this passivity could lead to spiritual laziness, or worse.
And the accusations against him got very serious very quickly.
Dramatically so. Molinos was accused of teaching that the soul became impeccable in this contemplative state, that God sometimes actually willed people to sin, maybe to test them,
Wow.
and that traditional spiritual practices, confession, prayer cycles, things like that, were unnecessary, even absurd.
And crucially, didn't they accuse him of using this doctrine to justify or permit immoral acts and indecent acts with women?
Yes, that was a major part of it. The sources say he actually confessed to performing these acts.
He confessed.
He did. But he claimed they were non-sinful acts of purification of the senses. Because, he argued, his higher faculties, his will and intellect remained united with God throughout.
A defense that, I imagine, did not go over well with the Inquisition or the Pope.
Not at all. Far from it. He was condemned. Pope Innocent XI issued the bull Coelestis Pastor in 1687, condemning 68 specific propositions taken from Molinos' teachings. It basically shut down the Quietist movement as a public thing.
So with mysticism, we see this arc. Initial caution, maybe confusion, then harsher persecution for some, but maybe a softening later for others.
Exactly. The sources point out that over time, cases involving women who were labeled elusus, sort of deluded women, show a decline in severity.
How so?
Figures like Esperanza Bueno were sent to an insane hospital. Which, look, it's certainly not great, but it's a big step away from a full-blown heresy trial and burning. Francisca de Paula Caballero was incarcerated, but her alleged accomplice just got exile, not execution. It suggests the Inquisition started, in some cases anyway, to treat certain spiritual or maybe mental states less as outright heresy and more as, well, delusion or perhaps a moral failing.
That's a really surprising insight from your sources, moving from theological judgment to something almost like custodial care or exile for some of these mystic-adjacent cases.
It shows the institution could adapt even as slowly. They weren't static.
Okay, so from these internal spiritual states, let's pivot to something more outward. Popular beliefs like sorcery and witchcraft. This has a long history in Spain, right?
Oh, absolutely. Belief in magic, witchcraft, divination, it was deeply embedded. You had influences from Visigothic times, from Moorish traditions, Jewish traditions too, often tied up with a kind of fatalism or trying to gain control through fortune-telling.
And secular law was already harsh on this before the Inquisition got involved.
Very harsh. There was a law from 1387 punishing diviners as heretics, and another in 1414 ordering secular judges to use the death penalty for sorcerers.
So when did the Inquisition step in? What was their angle?
They claimed jurisdiction by defining witchcraft as involving a pact with the demon.
Ah, the pact.
Yes, that pact was considered a form of apostasy turning away from God, and apostasy qualified as heresy, putting it squarely in their territory.
But interestingly, there was debate within the Inquisition itself about how real all this witchcraft stuff was.
Absolutely, a real internal debate. Some early inquisitors were quite skeptical. They even cited an old text, the Canon Episcopi, which suggested that beliefs about witches flying, attending Sabbats, all that it was mostly illusions or dreams caused by demons, not actual physical events.
So some of them thought it was just demons tricking people into thinking they were witches, like messing with their heads.
Precisely. They believed in the power of the demon, for sure, but they doubted the reality of the actions people confessed to. However, others, especially later, fully accepted the horrors and crimes attributed to witches as real.
And that led to some serious early persecutions.
Yes, like the burnings of over 30 accused witches in Biscay back in 1507 and a persecution in Catalonia around 1517.
But then, similar to the mysticism shift, there was another major turning point, perhaps even more dramatic for witchcraft.
Yes, a really crucial one. The investigation led by Inquisitor Juan Valle de Alvarado in Navarre. This was around the late 16th, early 17th century.
Okay.
He spent years meticulously investigating these witchcraft claims. He questioned the confessions, looked hard for external, physical evidence.
And what did he find? His conclusions were pretty groundbreaking for the time, weren't they?
Absolutely revolutionary. Alvarado concluded that the confessed acts flying, Going to Sabbats, cursing neighbors, all of it were not real events. They were delusions of the
Oh,
demon.
delusion.
Yes, often induced, he found, by threats or even torture during earlier interrogations by secular authorities. He decided the accusations were just unreliable, no external proof.
And this conclusion, coming from inside the Inquisition, from one of their own investigators, that changed everything.
It led to a dramatic policy shift. The Suprema, that's the governing council of the Inquisition, they ordered caution and moderation in witchcraft cases. Now, they didn't totally ditch the theory of a pact with the demon, but they effectively adopted Alvarado's view that the acts themselves were delusions.
This is such a key insight from your sources. Spain, almost uniquely in Europe at the time, pivoted away from mass witch hunts decades, sometimes centuries, earlier than places like Germany or France. And largely because of this internal investigation concluding it was delusion, that's genuinely surprising.
It really is, and the result was that by the 18th century, witchcraft cases had virtually disappeared from Inquisition records. There's an example from Toledo.
Yeah.
Not a single case between 1648 and 1794.
Incredible.
They even went so far as to prosecute people who took the law into their own hands and attacked or beat suspected witches.
Wait, they punished the witch hunters?
Yes, they prioritized maintaining public order over chasing down alleged witchcraft, which they increasingly saw as delusion. Popular belief persisted, mind you, and isolated cases still popped up later, but the official policy had fundamentally shifted.
Actively stopping the witch hunts. Okay, one more unexpected area before we move to the state connection. Solicitation in confession. Priests abusing their position in the confessional.
Right. This crime, a priest soliciting a penitent, usually a woman, during the act of confession itself, was initially handled by ordinary spiritual courts, and those courts were often quite lenient.
But the Inquisition muscled in, again, by calling it a matter of faith.
Yes, that was their standard way in. They argued that only a priest with fundamentally incorrect faith, with heretical leanings, could so profoundly abuse a sacred sacrament like confession. Thus, it became a heresy-adjacent issue, falling under their jurisdiction.
And they put the burden on the penitent, the person being solicited, to report it.
They did. They set up a system where penitents were strongly admonished, urged, to denounce priests who did this. Later, papal decrees actually made it mandatory.
But I imagine that was incredibly difficult, getting women to denounce their own confessors.
Exactly. Fraught with difficulty, fear, shame, reluctance. All understandable.
And the rules for actually prosecuting these cases changed over time, making it even harder to get a conviction.
That's right. Initially, maybe one denunciation could trigger an investigation or deliberation, but later the rule became much stricter. You needed 2 separate and independent denunciations against the same priest for the same or similar kind of solicitation before an arrest or trial could even proceed.
Wow. 2 unrelated people reporting the same priest. That's a high bar.
A very high bar.
Yeah.
And the source notes this rule had far-reaching consequences, basically allowing, quote, innumerable culprits to escape prosecution.
So even when reported, it was tough to pursue. What were the punishments if someone was convicted?
Well, on paper, they could be severe, ranging from being forbidden to ever hear women's confessions again, periods of reclusion, exile, up to, in really scandalous or repeat cases, perpetual reclusion, degradation from the priesthood, being stripped of holy orders, or even the galleys.
The galleys. For soliciting in confession.
It was possible, yes, especially if it involved particular penitents or caused major public scandal.
Yet, despite those potential punishments, the sources mention the Inquisition started showing a kind of tenderness towards this offense in later periods.
Yeah, it's an interesting observation. It suggests that whatever the law said, the practical application might have varied. Perhaps there was a growing reluctance to pursue these difficult, embarrassing cases vigorously over time, and related issues like priests trying to absolve each other of this sin, or the separate but related offense of flagellantes priests stripping penitents during confession. Supposedly for penance, those were also subject to papal briefs and Inquisition oversight.
Okay, so that covers the surprising range of things they got involved in beyond simple heresy. But the Inquisition wasn't just wading into mysticism and moral failings, was it? It became a central, really powerful tool for the Spanish state.
Oh, absolutely. Its role fundamentally shifted over time. It became a vital instrument of the crown, essentially functioning as a form of, well, the source calls it hot police.
Haute police, like high-level secret police.
Exactly. Its structure, its secrecy, its ability to operate outside the normal legal rules and jurisdictions, All that made it incredibly useful to the monarchs.
And the Antonio Perez affair is maybe the prime example of this political use and the massive controversy it could stir up.
It's a huge landmark case, yeah. Antonio Perez was this powerful minister under Philip II, but he fell dramatically out of favor. He faced secular charges, treason, murder. To escape the king's direct reach, Perez fled to Aragon and appealed to the Justicia, their high judge. He relied on the Aragonese fueros.
The fueros, those were Aragon's traditional laws and rights, right?
Right.
Protecting them from arbitrary royal power.
Exactly. They guaranteed certain legal procedures, and that Aragonese courts had jurisdiction over matters within Aragon. They were fiercely defended.
So Aragon's local laws should have protected Perez from the king, but the Inquisition could override those.
Well, that was the flashpoint. The Inquisition claimed jurisdiction over Perez. They cooked up a pretty flimsy charge, something about him tampering with ciphers related to matters of faith.
The matter of faith justification again.
Always. This allowed them to demand custody of him, directly challenging and overriding the Aragonese fueros and the authority of the Justicia.
And this clash of jurisdictions led to outright rebellion.
It really did. It sparked huge unrest. The people of Aragon rose up, defending their fueros, defending the Justicia. This escalated into riots in Saragossa. Ultimately, the king's forces executed the Justicia, Juan de Lanuza. Philip II then sent a Castilian army into Aragon to crush the rebellion and assert royal authority, including the Inquisition's right to grab Perez.
Wow. So the king used the Inquisition to get his political enemy, and it literally caused him to have to invade one of his own kingdoms to enforce that power.
It was a brutal and dramatic demonstration of royal power, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And the Inquisition was the key instrument. Perez himself eventually managed to escape to France. And in a final, almost ironic twist, the Inquisition's council did eventually, years later, posthumously absolve Perez's memory in 1615. They declared his blood clean, his descendants free of any taint. But they kept the confiscated property. The political victory for the crown stood. The financial gain remained.
Beyond these huge dramatic clashes, was the Inquisition used more subtly against political figures who were just out of favor or maybe proposed inconvenient ideas?
Yes, definitely. Ministers who suggested reforms, especially reforms that might touch the Inquisition's own power or finances, they became quite vulnerable. Take Jovellanos, a leading Enlightenment figure, a government minister. He was in prison for years until 1808. Why? Based on a weak, anonymous denunciation that he was a Jansenist.
A Jansenist. We'll come back to that label. But the timing was convenient.
Extremely convenient. It came right after he proposed reforms that would have affected the Inquisition's funding.
And Mariano Luis de Urquijo, another reformer.
Same pattern. He faced a secret investigation by the Inquisition, apparently just for translating Voltaire, another figure linked to reformist ideas again, after Urquijo himself had proposed changes that might impact the Church or Inquisition.
Even established scholars weren't safe if they criticized the state.
No. The famous Jesuit historian Juan de Mariana, he was targeted by the Inquisition after he wrote a book criticizing the government's handling of coinage and certain officials.
What happened to him?
He was eventually released, but the message was crystal clear. Criticizing the state or its policies could bring the Inquisition down on you.
Okay, let's talk about that label you mentioned, Jansenism. It sounds like it became less about actual complex theology and more about political convenience.
That's a really significant insight here, I think. Jansenism was a complex theological movement, originally French, with specific views on grace and predestination. But in Spain, especially later on, that label became a convenient, almost meaningless political smear.
A political weapon.
Exactly. A stark example of how the Inquisition's power allowed theological labels to be weaponized against almost any form of perceived dissent or opposition.
The sources describe it as a hobgoblin, right? Like a boogeyman term.
Yeah, a catch-all term. You could be labeled a Jansenist if you advocated for bishops' rights against royal or papal overreach, what they called regalias, royal prerogatives, or if you criticized the Inquisition itself, or supported reforms, or even just expressed political disagreement.
So bishops just trying to assert their traditional authority could suddenly find themselves denounced as Jansenists.
It happened. Figures like Bonifaz or bishops like Joseph Clement and Agustin Abadi La Sierra faced such accusations. The Inquisition also actively prosecuted Freemasonry. They saw it as secretive, potentially subversive, and definitely heterodox. That led to cases against people like Francisco Arión de Roscobel or Domingo de Otas.
And they weren't just policing internal dissent, they were actively supporting the crown in external conflicts too, like wartime police.
Yes, acting as very loyal agents of the state. During the War of Spanish Succession under Philip V, they prosecuted clergy who were suspected of treason or supporting the rival claimant to the throne. Later on, under Fernando VII after Napoleon, they were explicitly ordered to monitor internal disaffection, to act as spies and reporters for the crown, identifying those sympathetic to liberal ideas or Napoleon's regime.
So that Hope Police function really became central later on.
The sources suggest it became the main work expected of the Inquisition in its final decades, yes.
And all this state utility, this power, hinged on their ability to just declare something a matter of faith whenever they needed to grab jurisdiction.
That seems to be the key mechanism. By labeling things like bigamy or solicitation or even political criticism as issues somehow touching upon faith, they could assert their exclusive jurisdiction. This often overrode secular courts, or the bishop's courts, creating ongoing friction, but cementing the Inquisition's unique and powerful position, accountable mainly to the monarch, not other legal bodies.
So it was a powerful, adaptable state tool with surprising reach. What was the broader impact of all this on Spain itself over the centuries?
Well, the impact was profound and tragically often detrimental to Spain's long-term development, according to these sources. Intellectually, for instance, the Inquisition's role as censor was just devastating.
Censoring works by major figures, we heard about Santa Teresa, but also non-religious books from abroad. What else?
Yeah, the reach was wide. They censored Montano's biblical commentaries, Mariana's book criticizing the government, even eventually things like Robinson Crusoe were indexed or censored at various points.
Robinson Crusoe.
Apparently so. This pervasive censorship, combined with the atmosphere of fear and suspicion it fostered, actively discouraged original scholarship, free inquiry, intellectual exchange. It contributed significantly to what historians often call Spain's intellectual torpor.
Torpor. Stagnation.
Exactly. The sources mention examples like Father Obago, a royal confessor, actually begrudging funds for historians because he saw history as unproductive.
Wow.
And perhaps the most stark statistic provided is that less printing was apparently occurring in Spain at the start of the 19th century than back in the 15th century under Queen Isabella, before the Inquisition was even fully established nationwide.
That's chilling. A decline in printing over centuries. What about the economic impact?
Economically, the practice of confiscating the property of the condemned was destabilizing. This wealth was often seized, then wasted or siphoned off by officials or favorites, rather than being productively invested. Now, historians debate the exact scale of the Inquisition's profits and the overall economic impact, but the policy itself is certainly disruptive.
And perhaps more significantly, the expulsion and persecution of highly productive groups within Spain.
Yes, absolutely crucial. The expulsion of the Jews in 1492, and later the Moriscos, the descendants of Muslims who had converted to Christianity, along with the ongoing suspicion and persecution of conversos, Jewish converts and their descendants, and Moriscos who remained in Spain. This drained the country of vital, skilled artisans, merchants, financiers, educated individuals. It represented a huge loss of human and financial capital.
And combined with other factors, heavy taxation, a large clergy population that didn't engage in manual labor, underinvestment in infrastructure like roads, it created serious economic headwinds for Spain over the long run.
Definitely contributing factors to Spain's relative economic decline compared to other European powers.
And socially, what was the impact on everyday life, on the mood of the country?
Socially, the Inquisition engendered this pervasive climate of fear and suspicion. The constant possibility of denunciation, maybe by a neighbor, a rival, even family, the secrecy of the proceedings, the intense pressure to conform outwardly and prove your limpieza de sangre.
Limpieza de sangre, purity of blood, meaning no Jewish or Moorish ancestry.
Exactly. All this created a stifling environment. The sources use a powerful phrase. It paralyzed both the will and the power. It discouraged initiative, risk-taking, open expression for generations.
And this climate of fear must make it hard to assess the human toll accurately, especially beyond just executions.
It does. You have early historians like Llorente writing in the 19th century who gave very high estimates for the total number of victims, particularly executions figures that contributed heavily to the Black Legend of Spain.
Right.
But more recent scholarship, looking directly at surviving tribunal records like those meticulously kept for Toledo between 1575 and 1610, these show relatively fewer burnings than Llorente's amplified figures. They also confirm that the severity of punishment definitely decreased over the centuries, especially for crimes like mysticism or witchcraft, as we discussed.
So, while the total number of executions, especially in later centuries, might have been lower than the darkest versions of the legends suggest, the chilling effect, the fear of the institution, that remained very real, and had a lasting social impact.
Precisely. The threat, the potential, was often more significant than the actual number of extreme punishments in the later centuries. The fear was pervasive.
And this powerful, multifaceted, feared institution, it didn't last forever. How did it finally end?
No, its end came in stages, really. It was first suppressed by Napoleon's forces in 1808, during the Peninsular War. That was part of the French attempt to impose reforms and modernize Spain.
But then it came back.
Yes, it was restored when the very conservative King Fernando II returned to power in 1814. Part of his whole effort to roll back the clock, undo liberal reforms, and restore absolute monarchy.
But its restoration didn't stick for long.
No. Public opposition had grown. It was suppressed again relatively quickly by the Liberal Cortes of Parliament in 1820. This happened amidst popular unrest. There were riots in Barcelona where the Inquisition building was actually sacked.
So some popular support for getting rid of it by then.
Seems so. Bishops were then tasked with creating these things called juntas de fe, basically committees of faith, to handle purely religious matters, but without the Inquisition's vast judicial powers or secrecy.
But Fernando VII regained his absolute power after that liberal period, didn't he? With help from outside forces.
He did. He got absolute power back with the help of the conservative Holy Alliance powers and a French invasion in 1823, which crushed the liberals.
So why didn't he fully restore the Inquisition again then, if it had been such a useful tool for the monarchy?
That's a really interesting point. He could have, but he chose not to. Even Fernando, the arch-conservative, kept the Inquisition suspended.
Curious. Any idea why?
Well, the sources don't give a definitive single reason. Maybe it had just become too politically controversial, having been suppressed twice with some clear popular support against it. Or perhaps its functions as political police could now be handled by other, more modern state security forces. The political landscape was changing. Whatever the exact mix of reasons, he kept it suspended.
Which led to its final permanent end.
Yes. The Spanish Inquisition was definitively and finally dissolved in 1834, no longer deemed necessary or politically viable by the Spanish state.
So wrapping this up, this deep dive, drawing on your source material, has really shown us the Spanish Inquisition was far more than that simple, monolithic religious court of popular myth.
Absolutely. It was a dynamic, complex institution, deeply, deeply intertwined with the Spanish state.
Its targets ranged way beyond obvious heresy-challenging forms of mysticism. Popular beliefs like sorcery, though, with that surprising internal shift towards skepticism later on.
Moral failings like solicitation and confession, and crucially, political opposition, criticism of the state, and calls for reform.
Its influence stretched far beyond just the autos de fe, didn't it? Profoundly shaping Spain's intellectual environment through censorship.
Impacting its economic path through policies like confiscation and the persecution or expulsion of key groups.
And creating that pervasive social atmosphere of suspicion and fear that really seems to have hindered initiative for centuries.
It's a powerful case study in how institutions, even those claiming divine authority, can be shaped by and used by temporal power for very earthly ends.
Indeed. Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you, our listener, to carry forward. Given how this institution, claiming religious authority, became so deeply enmeshed with state power, so readily used for political ends, what does this historical case tell us about the enduring tension between spiritual claims and temporal control throughout history? And perhaps, what echoes might we see even today?
Something to think about.
Definitely something to mull over until our next deep dive.